Welcome to Truth Behind History, where we dive deep into the past to uncover the events that shaped the world as we know it today. In this video, we are going on a journey through the history of Russia, one of the most fascinating and complex nations in the world. From its humble beginnings in Kievan Rus to its rise as a global superpower, Russia's history is a tale of conquest, revolution, and resilience. We'll explore the wars that defined it, the leaders who shaped it, and the cultural and political forces that continue to influence it today. Our journey is divided into three key themes. First, we will explore the origins of Russia, tracing its development from Kievan Rus to the modern Russian state. How did a collection of Slavic tribes transform into one of the most powerful nations on Earth? What were the key moments that defined its early history? Next, we will examine the wars and revolutions that shaped Russia's destiny. Russia's past is filled with conflicts, from Mongol invasions to global wars and internal uprisings. These battles didn't just decide the fate of the country, they reshaped its society, its government, and its place in the world. Finally, we will look at Russia's global influence. Beyond its military and territorial ambitions, Russia has played a key role in shaping world politics, culture, and diplomacy. Whether through ideological struggles, economic power, or cultural contributions, Russia has left an undeniable mark on the modern world. So sit back, and let's begin this journey through Russia's past. Our first stop takes us to the foundation of Russian civilization itself, the rise of Kievan Rus. To understand the origins of Russia, we must go back more than 1,000 years to the era of Kievan Rus, a medieval state that laid the foundation for what would eventually become modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. But Kievan Rus wasn't just the beginning of a nation, it was a powerful federation that connected the Slavic world with the rest of medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire. The story of Kievan Rus begins with the Varangians, a group of Norse traders and warriors who traveled along the river systems of Eastern Europe. These seafarers, originating from what is now Sweden, made their way down the Dnieper River and integrated with local Slavic tribes. The term Rus is believed to have been derived from these Norse settlers, who established a ruling dynasty that would dominate the region for centuries. By the 10th century, Kievan Rus had developed into a structured and influential state with Kiev as its capital. Kiev was strategically located along the trade route that connected northern Europe to the Byzantine Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations of the time. This trade network was crucial, allowing the people of Kievan Rus to prosper through the exchange of furs, honey, wax, and even slaves, which were highly valued commodities in medieval markets. Trade wasn't the only thing that flowed through Kievan Rus, ideas and culture did as well. In 988, Grand Prince Vladimir the Great made a decision that would change the course of history. He converted to Orthodox Christianity and made it the official religion of Kievan Rus. This wasn't just a spiritual decision, it was a political one. Aligning with the Byzantine Empire gave Kievan Rus greater legitimacy and strengthened its ties to one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the time. This conversion led to the spread of Byzantine religious, artistic, and architectural influences throughout the region, shaping the cultural identity of the Slavic world. But no civilization remains dominant forever. The strength of Kievan Rus began to decline due to internal fragmentation, as various princes and noble families competed for power. This infighting weakened the state, making it vulnerable to outside threats. The final blow came in 1240, when the Mongols, led by Batu Khan, launched a devastating invasion. The Mongols, known for their unmatched military strategy and sheer brutality, obliterated Kiev, leaving it in ruins. This Mongol conquest, often referred to as the Ch'tata Yoke, reshaped the future of the region. While the Mongols ruled indirectly, demanding tribute from local rulers, their presence fragmented Kievan Rus and shifted power away from Kiev. Over time, a new center of power would emerge, one that would eventually lead to the rise of the Russian state. That center was Moscow. So how did Moscow rise from the ashes of Kievan Rus? Let's move forward and find out. With the fall of Kiev and the decline of Kievan Rus, power shifted to the northeast, where Moscow, once a small and insignificant settlement, began its rise. But what made Moscow different? Why did it emerge as the new heart of the Russian world? The answer lies in its ability to adapt, consolidate power, and position itself as the spiritual successor of Orthodox Christianity. During the Mongol rule, Moscow's princes took a unique approach. Instead of openly resisting Mongol dominance, they collaborated. They acted as tax collectors for the Mongols, ensuring that tribute was paid while gradually expanding their own influence. This strategy not only allowed Moscow to grow in wealth and power but also positioned its rulers as indispensable intermediaries between the Mongols and the rest of the Rus territories. However, Moscow's rise wasn't just about politics, it was also about religion. In 1453, The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire sent shockwaves through the Orthodox Christian world. With the Byzantine capital now under Muslim rule, many Orthodox believers saw Moscow as the last remaining protector of the faith. This idea led to the concept of Moscow as the Third Rome, the successor to Rome, and Constantinople as the center of Christian civilization. This belief gave Moscow's rulers a sense of divine legitimacy, reinforcing their claim to power. This ideology would play a crucial role in shaping Russian identity for centuries to come. It justified Moscow's territorial expansion, centralized rule, and its increasing role as a leader of Orthodox Christianity. The Tsars would later use this idea to solidify their autocratic rule, arguing that they were not just political leaders, but divinely ordained rulers destined to protect Orthodox civilization. With the Mongol influence waning, Moscow continued to consolidate power, defeating rival principalities and establishing itself as the dominant force in the region. The Mongol yoke was finally broken in 1480 when Grand Prince Ivan III, known as Ivan the Great, refused to pay tribute, effectively ending Mongol rule over Moscow. This marked the beginning of a new era, one in which Moscow was no longer just another city in the fragmented Rus territories, but the emerging core of a unified Russian state. Now that Moscow had positioned itself as both a political and spiritual leader, the next phase in Russian history would be defined by its rulers' ambition to centralize power and expand the nation's borders. This brings us to one of the most infamous figures in Russian history, Ivan the Terrible. Let's continue. Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first ruler to formally take the title of Tsar of Russia. His reign was one of the most transformative in Russian history, marked by expansion, brutal repression, and the consolidation of autocratic power. But was he truly terrible, or was he simply a ruler who understood the necessity of absolute control in a land as vast and unstable as Russia? One of Ivan's greatest achievements was centralizing power. Before him, Russia was still fragmented, with powerful noble families, known as the boyars, holding significant influence. Ivan changed that. By declaring himself Tsar, he positioned himself as the supreme ruler, above the nobility, answerable only to God. This move weakened the boyars and strengthened the monarchy, setting the stage for the kind of centralized rule that would define Russia for centuries. But Ivan wasn't just focused on internal power, he was also determined to expand Russia's borders. Under his rule, Russia conquered the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, former Mongol territories that had long been a thorn in Moscow's side. These victories gave Russia control over vast new lands and secured its position as a major power in the region. However, expansion came at a cost. Ivan's later years were defined by increasing paranoia and brutality. In 1565, he established the Oprichnina, a secret police force that carried out purges against those he saw as enemies. The Oprichniki, as they were called, were notorious for their cruelty, executing thousands of nobles and ordinary citizens alike. This period, known as the Reign of Terror, destabilized Russia and created a legacy of fear and repression that would echo throughout its history. By the time of Ivan's death in 1584, Russia had become a vast and centralized state, but his rule also left the country in turmoil. The chaos and instability that followed would lead to one of the darkest periods in Russian history, the Time of Troubles, a period of political crisis and foreign intervention. But eventually, Russia would find stability again, this time under a ruler who would take the country in a new direction, one that would bring it closer to Europe. That ruler was Peter the Great. Let's move forward. By the late 17th century, Russia was still a medieval state in many ways. It lagged behind Western Europe in technology, trade, and governance. While France and England were developing modern economies and navies, Russia remained isolated, relying on outdated military tactics and feudal structures. That all changed with one man, Peter the Great. Peter wasn't just another Tsar, he was a visionary who saw Russia's potential on the world stage. He believed that in order for Russia to survive and compete with the great European powers, it needed to modernize. And he wasn't interested in gradual reforms, he wanted a complete transformation of Russian society, government, and military. One of Peter's biggest priorities was westernization. He looked to the nations of Western Europe, England, France, and the Netherlands as models for progress. To achieve this, he made a bold move. He traveled to Europe in disguise. This journey, known as the Grand Embassy, took Peter across the continent, where he studied shipbuilding in the Netherlands, observed parliamentary government in England, and even worked in a dockyard to understand naval construction firsthand. He was the first Russian ruler to travel extensively in the West, and what he saw convinced him that Russia needed to change. When he returned, Peter launched a series of sweeping reforms. He forced the nobility to adopt European customs, including Western-style clothing and shaved beards, something that horrified the conservative boyars, who saw facial hair as a symbol of their status. He restructured the government, creating new administrative systems modeled after European institutions. And most importantly, he reorganized the Russian military, building a modern standing army and, for the first time in Russian history, establishing a powerful navy. But modernization wasn't just about appearances, it was about power. Peter wanted Russia to be a dominant force in Europe, and that meant securing warm water ports that wouldn't freeze in the winter. This led to his most ambitious military campaign, the Great Northern War against Sweden. Sweden, under King Charles XII, was one of the most formidable military powers of the time. But after years of conflict, Peter's army emerged victorious, securing access to the Baltic Sea. This victory allowed Peter to build his greatest project, St. Petersburg. He wanted a new capital that would symbolize Russia's transformation, and he built it from the ground up on land conquered from Sweden. The city was designed in a European style, with grand palaces, canals, and wide boulevards, a stark contrast to the medieval layout of Moscow. He called it Russia's window to Europe, reflecting his vision of a modern, outward-looking Russia. By the time of Peter's death in 1725, Russia had undergone a complete transformation. It had a modern military, a navy that could compete with European fleets, and a new capital that embodied its ambitions. But Peter's reforms came at a cost. His relentless drive for modernization was often brutal, with forced labor, high taxation, and widespread resistance from traditionalists. Still, Peter the Great set Russia on a new path, one that would lead it to become one of the most powerful empires in the world. And while Peter laid the foundation, another ruler would take his vision even further. That ruler was Catherine the Great. Let's continue. When Catherine the Great took the throne in 1762, Russia was already a rising power, but under her rule, it would become an empire in every sense of the word, expanding its borders, embracing Enlightenment ideals, and solidifying its role as a dominant force in European affairs. Catherine wasn't born Russian, she was a German princess, originally named Sophie, who married into the Russian royal family. But after a coup against her husband, Tsar Peter III, she seized the throne and ruled as Empress of Russia. Unlike many rulers before her, Catherine saw herself as an intellectual, inspired by the ideas of the European Enlightenment. She corresponded with thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot, believing that reason, education, and legal reform were the keys to a strong nation. One of Catherine's most significant achievements was territorial expansion. Under her reign, Russia expanded southward and westward, annexing Crimea, parts of Poland, and securing control over the Black Sea. This was crucial because it gave Russia direct access to warm water ports, strengthening its navy and allowing for year-round trade with Europe. By the end of her reign, Russia's borders stretched farther than ever before, making it one of the largest empires in the world. But Catherine's ambitions went beyond military conquest. She wanted to reform Russian society. Inspired by Enlightenment thinkers, she promoted education, the arts, and legal reforms. She founded the first state-funded schools for girls, expanded universities, and supported literature and philosophy. She also attempted to modernize Russian law, though much of this remained theoretical rather than practical. However, Catherine's reign was also deeply contradictory. While she spoke of freedom and progress, she also strengthened serfdom, the system that kept millions of Russian peasants in near slavery. She gave even more power to the nobility, ensuring their loyalty but deepening the divide between the rich and the poor. This contradiction between progress and repression would remain at the heart of Russian society for generations. By the time of Catherine's death in 1796, Russia was larger, more powerful, and more European than ever before. But beneath the surface, social unrest was brewing. The vast empire she helped create would soon face major conflicts, both against external enemies and from within. One of the first great tests of Russia's strength would come in 1812, when Napoleon's army invaded. What happened next would go down in history as one of the greatest military disasters of all time. Let's move forward. By the early 19th century, Napoleon Bonaparte was the most feared military leader in Europe. He had already conquered much of the continent, and now, in 1812, he turned his sights on Russia. With an army of over 600,000 men, Napoleon launched his invasion of Russia, expecting a swift victory. But the Russian military had other plans. Instead of meeting Napoleon in open battle, they retreated, drawing the French army deeper and deeper into Russian territory. This was part of the scorched earth policy, a brutal but effective military strategy in which the Russians burned crops, destroyed supplies, and abandoned towns to deny Napoleon's army the resources they needed to survive. As the French advanced, they found nothing but desolate, empty land. By the time they reached Moscow, Napoleon expected the city to surrender. Instead, the Russians set it on fire. With no food, no shelter, and no victory, Napoleon was forced to retreat. Then came the real disaster, the Russian winter. As Napoleon's army tried to escape back to France, they faced freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant attacks from Russian forces. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Out of the 600,000 men who invaded Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out alive. The defeat of Napoleon in Russia was one of the turning points of the Napoleonic Wars. It proved that no matter how powerful an army was, Russia's sheer size and harsh climate made it nearly impossible to conquer. This lesson would be learned again in the 20th century, when another invader, Adolf Hitler, would make the same fatal mistake. For now, though, Russia had secured its place as a great European power. But another war was on the horizon, one that would reveal serious weaknesses in the Russian Empire. That war was the Crimean War. Let's continue. By the mid-19th century, Russia had grown into a vast empire, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. On the surface, it seemed like an unstoppable force. But beneath the grand image of imperial might, serious weaknesses were beginning to show. The Crimean War, fought between 1853 and 1856, would expose just how outdated Russia's military and infrastructure had become. So what started this war? The conflict arose from a struggle for power in the Black Sea region. Russia wanted to expand its influence over the Ottoman Empire, which was weakening and losing control over its territories. The Ottoman Empire, however, was backed by Britain and France, who saw Russia's expansion as a threat to the balance of power in Europe. When Russia attempted to assert control over Ottoman territories, Britain and France declared war. On the battlefield, the war revealed Russia's serious military shortcomings. Unlike Britain and France, which had embraced the Industrial Revolution and modernized their armies, Russia was still using outdated tactics and weaponry. Its soldiers were poorly equipped, its supply lines were unreliable, and its infrastructure, especially its railroads, was far behind its European rivals. The Russian army struggled to move troops and supplies efficiently, leading to disastrous losses. One of the most famous battles of the war took place at Sevastopol, a key Russian naval base on the Crimean Peninsula. The siege lasted nearly a year, with massive casualties on both sides. Despite fierce resistance, Russia was ultimately forced to surrender the city in 1855. The war also became famous for its impact on medicine and military logistics. The terrible conditions in battlefield hospitals led to major reforms in nursing, thanks in part to Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized medical care for wounded soldiers. By the time the war ended in 1856, Russia had been humiliated. It had lost Sevastopol, suffered heavy casualties, and failed to achieve its territorial ambitions. More importantly, the war proved that Russia was not as powerful as it seemed. It was lagging behind Western Europe in military technology, transportation, and government efficiency. This shocking realization led to major reforms. Tsar Alexander II, recognizing that Russia needed to modernize, abolished serfdom in 1861, ending centuries of feudal bondage for millions of Russian peasants. He also pushed for military and economic modernization, attempting to catch up with the more industrialized European nations. However, change did not come easily. The Russian Empire remained deeply conservative, and the seeds of social unrest were already being planted. Within a few decades, Russia would face a revolutionary crisis that would shake the empire to its core. But before we get there, Russia had another war to fight, this time, against a rising power in the east. That war was the Russo-Japanese War. Let's move forward. For centuries, Russia had been expanding eastward, absorbing vast territories in Siberia and the Far East. By the early 20th century, it set its sights on Manchuria and Korea, seeing them as crucial to its strategic and economic interests. But there was a problem. Japan had the same ambitions. At the time, Japan was a rapidly modernizing nation. After years of isolation, it had embraced Western military tactics and industrialization, building a powerful navy and army. Russia, on the other hand, still relied on outdated military strategies, believing that its sheer size would be enough to secure victory. Japan struck first, launching a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1904. This marked the beginning of a brutal war that would become one of the most humiliating defeats in Russian history. The key battle of the war took place at Tsushima in 1905, where Japan's navy completely destroyed the Russian fleet. It was the first time in modern history that an Asian power decisively defeated a European power, shocking the world and proving that Japan had emerged as a dominant military force. The defeat had enormous consequences for Russia. It weakened the monarchy, exposed deep corruption and inefficiency in the government, and led to widespread unrest at home. The loss directly contributed to the Revolution of 1905, where protests and strikes erupted across Russia, forcing Tsar Nicholas II to grant political concessions, including the creation of a parliament, the Duma. But these concessions weren't enough to stop the growing revolutionary movement. The monarchy had been severely weakened, and it was only a matter of time before Russia would face a full-scale revolution. That moment came in 1917, in one of the most significant political upheavals of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. Let's continue. The early 20th century was a time of growing unrest in Russia. Years of economic hardship, military failures, and social inequality had created deep frustration among the people. The monarchy, led by Tsar Nicholas II, had lost the trust of the population. The final straw came during World War I, when Russia suffered massive military defeats and severe shortages of food and supplies at home. In February 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, the capital of Russia. What started as a demand for bread quickly turned into a mass uprising. Soldiers refused to fire on demonstrators, and within days, the Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne, ending centuries of Romanov rule. But the fall of the monarchy didn't bring stability. A provisional government was set up, but it was weak and unable to address the demands of the people. Meanwhile, a radical socialist movement known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, was gaining momentum. In October 1917, Lenin and the Bolsheviks launched a coup against the provisional government, seizing power in what became known as the October Revolution. Lenin's slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," resonated with the masses, especially soldiers and peasants who had suffered through the war. But not everyone supported the Bolsheviks. This led to the Russian Civil War, a brutal conflict between Lenin's Red Army and the anti-communist White Army, which included monarchists, liberals, and foreign powers trying to stop the rise of communism. After years of bloodshed, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, and in 1922, they officially established the Soviet Union, creating the world's first communist state. Russia had been completely transformed, from an empire ruled by a Tsar to a communist state under Lenin. The revolution had ended the old order, but it was only the beginning of a much larger political struggle. The Soviet Union would soon face another major challenge, a battle for global dominance against the West in what became known as the Cold War. Let's move forward. The Russian Revolution had shattered the old imperial order, but in its place, a new power was rising, the Soviet Union. Established in 1922 after the Bolshevik victory in the Russian Civil War, the USSR was built on communist ideology, aiming to create a classless, state-controlled economy under the leadership of the Communist Party. But while the revolution promised equality and prosperity, the reality was far more complex. At its core, the early years of the Soviet Union were defined by consolidation of power and brutal economic transformation. Under Vladimir Lenin, policies like war communism and later the new economic policy sought to stabilize the economy after years of war. But after Lenin's death in 1924, the power struggle for leadership culminated in the rise of Joseph Stalin, who would transform the Soviet Union into a global superpower, but at a tremendous human cost. Stalin's policies, particularly forced collectivization of agriculture, led to widespread famine, including the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions starved to death. His rule was marked by the Great Purge, a brutal campaign of political repression that saw thousands executed or sent to labor camps, known as gulags. Despite this, Stalin also spearheaded the industrialization of the Soviet Union, rapidly expanding heavy industry, infrastructure, and military production. By the late 1930s, the USSR had become one of the world's largest economies, but at the price of millions of lives lost to famine, forced labor, and political persecution. Then came World War II, where the Soviet Union would play a decisive role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. But before we discuss the war, let's take a step back and look at one of the most crucial moments in Soviet history, the German invasion of the USSR. For the Soviet Union, World War II wasn't just another conflict, it was an existential fight for survival. Known in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, it began in June 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers stormed across Soviet borders, aiming to capture Moscow and crush the Soviet state. The initial months of the invasion were devastating. The Soviet military, unprepared for the speed and precision of the German blitzkrieg, suffered massive losses. Entire divisions were wiped out and cities like Kiev and Smolensk fell quickly. But despite these defeats, the USSR refused to surrender. The turning point came in 1942 and 1943 at the Battle of Stalingrad. This was one of the deadliest battles in human history, with over 1 million casualties. Soviet forces, under General Zhukov, encircled the German Sixth Army, forcing their surrender in early 1943. This marked the beginning of the Soviet counteroffensive. Shortly after, the Battle of Kursk in mid-1943 solidified the shift in momentum. The largest tank battle ever fought, Kursk saw Soviet forces successfully repel a massive German attack, proving that the Red Army was now on the offensive. From this point on, the Soviet Union pushed the Germans back, reclaiming lost territory and advancing toward Berlin. By May 1945, the Red Army had captured the German capital, forcing Hitler's surrender and bringing an end to World War II in Europe. The war had devastated the Soviet Union, killing over 20 million people and leaving cities in ruins. But it also elevated the USSR to superpower status, setting the stage for the Cold War, a 45-year-long struggle for global influence between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's move forward. With the defeat of Nazi Germany, two nations emerged as the world's dominant superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. But these two powers had fundamentally different ideologies. While the United States championed capitalism and democracy, the Soviet Union sought to expand communism. This ideological divide sparked the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry, nuclear brinkmanship, and global conflicts. One of the defining aspects of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Both the United States and the Soviet Union amassed thousands of nuclear weapons, leading to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was simple: if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate with equal or greater force, effectively ensuring that both nations would be annihilated. This fear of total destruction prevented direct war, but kept the world in a constant state of tension. Beyond nuclear weapons, the Cold War also extended into space. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, shocking the world and proving that the Soviets had advanced rocket technology. 4 years later, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, marking another Soviet victory in the early space race. But the United States responded aggressively, ultimately winning the race to the moon with the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. Perhaps the most destructive aspect of the Cold War was the series of proxy wars fought across the globe. Rather than engaging in direct combat, the United States and the Soviet Union supported opposing sides in conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. These wars led to millions of deaths, with both superpowers using smaller nations as battlegrounds for their ideological struggle. By the 1980s, however, the Soviet Union was struggling economically. Decades of heavy military spending, inefficient centralized planning, and stagnation had taken their toll. This economic decline, coupled with growing nationalist movements in Eastern Europe, would lead to the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Let's explore how the Soviet Union fell. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the Soviet system was in serious trouble. Economic stagnation, political corruption, and growing unrest within Soviet republics created a crisis that could no longer be ignored. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader from 1985 to 1991, attempted to reform the system with two key policies. First, perestroika, or restructuring, aimed to introduce limited free market elements into the Soviet economy. Second, glasnost, or openness, encouraged freedom of speech and political discussion. But instead of saving the Soviet Union, these reforms accelerated its collapse. As people gained more freedom to criticize the government, nationalist movements demanded independence, leading to revolutions in Soviet-controlled Eastern European countries. By 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the end of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. In 1991, facing massive protests and political chaos, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. 15 independent countries emerged from the former Soviet Empire, marking the end of the Cold War and the beginning of modern Russia. With the Soviet Union gone, Russia entered a period of political and economic instability. But in the 2000s, a new leader would rise, Vladimir Putin. Let's explore Russia in the 21st century. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia entered a period of extreme economic hardship and political instability. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a more market-driven system was chaotic, leading to the rise of powerful oligarchs, businessmen who acquired vast wealth through privatization deals. Corruption, crime, and economic collapse plagued the nation throughout the 1990s. By the time Vladimir Putin took power in 2000, Russia was a shadow of its former self, its global influence diminished, its economy weak, and its people struggling. Putin, a former KGB officer, came to power promising stability, strength, and national revival. His leadership quickly centralized control, cracking down on political opposition and consolidating power in the hands of the Kremlin. Through constitutional reforms, Putin has remained at the center of Russian politics for over 2 decades, either as president or prime minister. Economically, Russia saw significant growth in the 2000s, largely driven by oil and gas exports. The country became a major supplier of energy to Europe and Asia, using its vast natural resources as a tool of economic and geopolitical influence. However, despite this wealth, much of the economy remained dependent on resource exports, making it vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices. Geopolitically, Putin sought to reassert Russia's influence on the world stage. This became evident in 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, signaling its willingness to use military force to maintain influence over former Soviet territories. Russia also intervened in Syria's civil war in 2015, backing the regime of Bashar al-Assad to secure a strategic foothold in the Middle East. But no action has had greater consequences than Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Let's explore the origins and impact of the war. The roots of the Russia-Ukraine war go back decades, shaped by historical, political, and strategic tensions. After the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Ukraine became an independent country, but Russia has long viewed Ukraine as part of its historical and geopolitical sphere of influence. Tensions escalated in 2014 when Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown in a popular uprising known as the Euromaidan Revolution. In response, Russia annexed Crimea, a strategic peninsula in southern Ukraine, and backed pro-Russian separatists in the eastern regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, leading to an ongoing conflict. Then, in February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, citing NATO expansion, security concerns, and historical claims to Ukrainian territory. This invasion was the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II and triggered massive international condemnation. The war has had devastating consequences. Thousands of civilians and soldiers have been killed, cities have been destroyed, and millions of Ukrainians have been displaced. Western nations imposed severe economic sanctions on Russia, cutting it off from key financial systems and limiting its energy exports. Militarily, the war has exposed the weaknesses of the Russian army, which struggled with logistical failures, troop morale issues, and strong Ukrainian resistance backed by Western military aid. The war also significantly strengthened NATO, with Finland and Sweden moving to join the alliance, something Russia had long sought to prevent. Geopolitically, the war has reshaped global alliances, intensifying tensions between Russia and Western nations while pushing Moscow closer to China and other non-Western powers. The outcome of the war remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: this conflict will shape global politics for years to come. But beyond military power, what role does Russia play on the global stage today? Let's explore Russia's global influence. Despite economic sanctions and political isolation from the West, Russia remains a major global power, largely due to its military strength, economic influence, and diplomatic reach. Militarily, Russia still possesses one of the world's largest armed forces, including the largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. While its conventional military has struggled in Ukraine, Russia remains a significant player in global security and defense industries. Economically, Russia plays a key role in global energy markets. It is one of the world's largest exporters of oil, natural gas, and raw materials, supplying energy to Europe, China, and other regions. However, the war in Ukraine has led to major shifts in global energy trade, with European nations seeking alternatives to Russian gas. Culturally and diplomatically, Russia maintains influence through media, alliances, and historical ties. It continues to exert soft power in post-Soviet states, Africa, and the Middle East, positioning itself as an alternative to Western influence. However, Russia faces significant challenges as it navigates the 21st century. Let's examine its future. Russia stands at a critical crossroads. The coming decades will be shaped by several key factors. First, economic and technological evolution. Russia's economy remains highly dependent on oil and gas, but global shifts toward renewable energy and digital transformation could challenge its long-term economic stability. Investing in technology, infrastructure, and innovation will be crucial if Russia wants to remain competitive. Second, geopolitical challenges. Continued tensions with NATO, economic sanctions, and military conflicts will shape Russia's international position. At the same time, its relationships with China, India, and other emerging powers could create new strategic alliances. Third, domestic stability and governance. Internally, Russia faces political dissent, economic uncertainty, and an aging population. Whether the government can maintain control and adapt to modern challenges will determine its long-term trajectory. Ultimately, Russia's ability to adapt, modernize, and navigate global power shifts will define its role in the future world order. But before we conclude, let's reflect on Russia's historical legacy. Throughout its history, Russia has been a land of contrasts and contradictions, a nation of vast power, yet deep internal struggles, of cultural brilliance, yet political repression. From the rise of Kievan Rus to the Soviet superpower, from the wars of expansion to the modern geopolitical battles, Russia has continually shaped the course of world history. Its impact on global events is undeniable. Whether through war, diplomacy, or cultural influence, Russia's legacy is one of resilience, ambition, and transformation. As Russia moves forward, its historical lessons will shape its strategies, policies, and relationships with the rest of the world. And with that, we conclude our deep dive into Russia's history, wars, and legacy. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History for more deep dives into the past. And if you love history, be sure to check out our other videos for more fascinating stories from around the world. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.